All right, let's jump right in. We're diving into a complicated situation today. U.S. involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're focusing specifically on the sanctions against Israeli settlers. And get this, President Trump just lifted them.
Yep.
So you've got some really good articles on this topic. So let's get right into it.
Yeah, definitely a move that has gotten attention from everywhere. The international community's really taken notice. There's a lot to talk about here. I think a good place to start is by understanding what these sanctions even meant, what they were all about.
Okay, so you've been reading, why has U.S. President Trump removed sanctions on Israeli settlers? What exactly were these sanctions?
So basically, they were financial, put in place by the Biden administration. Think like blocked assets, frozen bank accounts, that sort of thing.
Right.
Essentially, the U.S. made it impossible for the people targeted by these sanctions to do business with any U.S. entities or even hold money in U.S. banks.
Wow, that's pretty serious,
Wow.
hitting them where it hurts their wallets. Who exactly were these sanctions targeting?
Well, it was a range of different people and groups, actually, like organizations, for example. You had they were really involved in building up these settlements. And their subsidiary, too. Both were accused of supporting extremist settler activity. Then there were also individuals who were sanctioned, like David Chazdai. He was actually convicted in Israel for violence against Palestinians.
So it sounds like they weren't just going after individuals, but the whole support system behind the settlement enterprise. Did they ever target the settlers themselves, the ones who actually built these illegal outposts?
Absolutely, yeah. The article mentioned a couple of examples, Zvi Bar Yosef and that controversial Sfis farm. Those were settlers who went ahead and built unauthorized outposts, and as a result, they were hit with these sanctions.
It's really interesting that the U.S. was willing to take such a strong stance against Israel, I mean. They're one of our closest allies, so what would make them make such a bold move?
Well, I think the Biden administration was under a lot of pressure at the time, a lot of pressure to take action against what Israel was doing in Gaza. Remember the 2024 war?
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of people calling for some pretty strong measures against Israel. People were saying things like halt arms sales and things like that. So these sanctions were seen as a less drastic way to show disapproval. They could signal that they weren't happy with Israel's actions without completely breaking off ties, you know?
I see. So it was a way to express their concern, but without completely ruining the relationship. But even so, these sanctions were definitely controversial, right?
Oh, absolutely. Some people saw them as just a symbolic gesture, basically a way to appease critics without actually changing anything, while others thought they were way too much, that they were actually putting a strain on the U.S.-Israel relationship, which could be dangerous.
So there was a lot of debate about whether the sanctions were too much or not enough. But the most important question is, did they even work? Did they actually manage to reduce the settler violence that they were supposed to address?
Well, that's where things get a bit complicated. You see, even with the sanctions in place, settler violence actually continued to get worse throughout 2024. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, they reported record numbers of attacks against Palestinians, and literally thousands of people were displaced from their homes.
Wow. So not exactly the outcome anyone was hoping for. Were there any specific cases during that time that really stood out?
Yeah, actually, Al Jazeera and Amnesty International both published reports about the situation. They highlighted tons of instances of settler violence. What was particularly concerning was that, well, a lot of the reports said that these attacks were just ignored. Or even worse, that the Israeli security forces actually supported them.
That's disturbing. I mean, that really makes you question whether there was a real commitment to doing anything about the violence. Was there any connection between these incidents and specific figures in the Israeli government?
Well, the reports did specifically point to incidents where the violence seemed to be condoned by security forces under the command of then National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. You know, he's definitely been a controversial figure.
Right. A name we'll definitely be talking more about later. And then, of course, Trump comes in and almost immediately lifts these sanctions. What was the reaction to that?
Oh, it was met with celebration, especially from figures on the Israeli far right. You know, like Bezalel Smotrich. He actually called the sanctions a severe and blatant foreign intervention in Israel's internal affairs.
So basically, they saw it as the U.S. meddling in something that wasn't their business. But this whole policy shift has really gotten people talking. What could this mean for the future of U.S.-Israel relations?
I think it's a potential sign of a major shift in U.S. policy towards the conflict.
Right.
We can't forget about Trump's history here, like moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. The Israeli right loved those moves, but internationally they were, well, pretty widely condemned.
Right, right. Those were seen as huge victories for the Israeli right.
Yeah.
But they definitely caused a lot of tension with the Palestinians and with the international community. So is there a concern that this could embolden those who want to see even more of the West Bank annexed?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a real worry. The article even points to people in Trump's inner circle who have very strong pro-settlement views, like Mike Huckabee. Trump actually chose him to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel, so that's something to think about. And also Miriam Adelson. She was a major donor to Trump's campaigns. Their influence within the administration is definitely something to keep in mind.
And then there's Elise Stefanik. She was nominated as a U.S. ambassador to the UN, and she's made statements about Israel's biblical right to the West Bank, right?
Exactly. And those kinds of statements, along with the lifting of sanctions, have really made people anxious. Anxious about what might happen next, Could this lead to more tension? Could it set back the peace process even further? There's just a lot of uncertainty right now.
So basically, a lot of uncertainty and a potentially very volatile situation developing.
Yeah.
What do you think will happen next? What role will the U.S. play in this conflict going forward?
That's the big question, isn't it? Trump's decision to lift the sanctions has really thrown things up in the air, and it's tough to predict what the long-term effects will be.
But maybe we can get some clues by looking at Trump's past actions, right? He's clearly shown that he's not afraid to break with traditional U.S. policy when it comes to Israel.
Oh, absolutely. Those moves with the embassy and the Golan Heights are perfect examples. And don't forget, he even went so far as to propose an initiative that would have basically recognized Israeli sovereignty over those illegal settlement blocks in the West Bank.
So lifting the sanctions could be just the first step in a much bigger change in U.S. policy. And the fact that some powerful figures in his administration are pushing for a more pro-settlement stance is, well, it's definitely a bit worrying.
Yeah, no, you're right on the money there. Their influence is significant, and they're going to be pushing for policies that align with their own vision for the region.
And then there's Mike Waltz, Trump's new national security advisor.
Yeah.
He seems to be very similar to, people like John Bolton, known for their hawkish views.
Yeah, and that raises the question of whether the U.S. will actually continue to play its traditional role as a mediator in the conflict.
I mean, if the U.S. is seen as siding with Israel, can there even be any real negotiations?
That's the core issue here. The U.S. has always played a really important role in trying to bring the Israelis and Palestinians together. But now their credibility as an honest broker is being seriously questioned.
Especially after these recent moves by Trump, right? It feels like appeasing the Israeli right has become more important than actually finding a lasting solution.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And the potential consequences of that kind of approach are pretty alarming.
I mean, we're already seeing tensions rising, more violence, and a growing lack of trust between the two sides.
Exactly. Without a clear commitment from the U.S. to engage in a fair and balanced way, well, the chances for peace are looking pretty bleak.
It's a pretty sobering thought. This conflict has been going on for decades now. And it's just heartbreaking to see it getting even worse.
It's definitely a tragedy. And the decisions that are being made right now by the people in power, they're going to have a lasting impact on this conflict. I mean, we're talking about generations to come.
It's a huge responsibility, and it's something we should all be paying attention to. But let's shift gears a little bit here and bring it back to the human cost of all of this. What is life actually like for the Palestinians who are living in the West Bank with all this tension and all these settlements expanding around them?
Well, to be honest, it's a really difficult reality for them. I mean, when these settlements expand, it often means that Palestinians lose their land, their movement is restricted, and they have limited access to basic necessities like water, for example.
Yeah.
It basically creates a system where Palestinians are living under a completely different set of rules than their Israeli neighbors.
The article mentioned that the UN documented thousands of Palestinians being displaced in 2024 alone. It's hard to even imagine having your home and your whole livelihood ripped away like that.
Oh, absolutely. And those reports from Al Jazeera and Amnesty International, they paint a very clear picture. They document the violence, the intimidation, the fear. It's something that many Palestinians have to live with every single day.
And this was all happening while the sanctions were still in place. It's kind of scary to think what it'll be like now that they're gone.
Yeah, it's a very legitimate concern. There's a real worry that lifting the sanctions will embolden the settlers, and that could lead to even more violence and land grabs.
It feels like this situation needs a response from the whole international community. Can other countries step in and hold Israel accountable for what's happening?
Well, there have been calls for international action, but it's a very complex issue. Israel has powerful allies, including the U.S., as we've discussed, and that makes it really hard to impose any meaningful consequences.
It's frustrating that these injustices can just continue. It seems like there are no repercussions at all.
It is frustrating, for sure, but it's important to remember that there are people and organizations out there who are working incredibly hard to document these human rights violations and advocate for change. They're the ones giving a voice to the people who are being silenced.
Like those reports from Al Jazeera and Amnesty International we've been talking about, right? They're doing really important work by exposing what's actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. And by staying informed and raising awareness ourselves, we can all play a role in putting pressure on those in power. Pressure to find a solution to this conflict, a solution that's just and fair for everyone involved.
So looking ahead, what do you think could happen in this region? I mean, it's already incredibly volatile.
Well, it's always hard to say for sure what the future holds, but we can definitely explore some possibilities. One scenario is that lifting the sanctions emboldens the Israeli right even further. That could lead to even more settlements and maybe even annexation of the West Bank.
That doesn't sound good at all.
No, it doesn't. It would most likely lead to more resistance from Palestinians, and that could potentially trigger another wave of violence.
Is there any hope left for a negotiated settlement?
Well, the two-state solution, which has been the framework for peace negotiations for decades now. It's looking increasingly unlikely. I mean, with the current political climate and the deep mistrust between the two sides, it's really hard to imagine them reaching an agreement anytime soon.
So we're basically stuck in a situation that seems impossible to resolve,
Mhm.
and there are no easy answers.
It's a very complex and challenging situation, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean we should just give up hope. I think it's more important now than ever to keep having these conversations, to engage with different perspectives, and to look for ways to build understanding and empathy.
You're right. Ignoring the problem won't make it disappear. We all have a responsibility to stay informed, to speak out against injustice, and to support those who are working to find a peaceful resolution.
Absolutely. The future of this region and the lives of millions of people are at stake. We can't afford to be complacent.
Well, this has been a really, really in-depth look at a truly complex and heartbreaking issue. It's a lot to take in, and we're definitely left with more questions than answers.
Yeah, that's often the case with conflicts like this one. They're multifaceted, but I think by struggling with these tough questions and by trying to understand all the different perspectives involved, we can contribute to a more informed and nuanced conversation.
And that's a really important first step towards finding a more peaceful future.
Absolutely. It all starts with awareness, empathy, and a willingness to engage in constructive dialogue.
We hope this discussion has been informative and has gotten you thinking. We encourage you to keep learning about this complex issue and to consider what role you can play in promoting peace and justice. Thanks for joining us on the DRM podcast.
We've been talking about the people who really push for these settlements, but I think we should look a little deeper into why they support them so strongly. What drives this commitment,
Yeah.
even when the whole world condemns it.
Yeah, it's definitely not just about politics or security, right? It's about something much deeper, something more fundamental.
Right, exactly. We're talking about deeply held beliefs, ideologies.
Ideologies that are really ingrained.
Exactly. For a lot of people in the Israeli right, these settlements are about fulfilling biblical prophecy. It's about reclaiming what they believe is their land, their rightful land.
So it's not just strategy then,
Right.
but a sense of historical and religious destiny.
Yeah, it plays a huge role. I mean, figures like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they often use those terms when they talk about the settlements. They talk about a connection to the West Bank that goes back centuries.
And these beliefs have real-world consequences, right? The article mentions Ben-Gvir suggesting that Israel should just annex the West Bank. And that was in response to Netanyahu facing an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court.
Yeah, that statement really says a lot, doesn't it? It shows that they're willing to escalate things, even if it means facing legal action.
And Smotrich, he apparently went even further. He actually ordered preparations for annexation back when Trump was first elected.
That's right. These aren't just fringe ideas, you know? We're talking about people in positions of power, people who are actually acting on these beliefs.
Which makes Trump's decision to lift the sanctions even more significant, right? It's almost like he's giving his approval to these expansionist ambitions.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. I mean, whether he intended to or not, the Trump administration is sending a message. They're saying that they're okay with actions that most of the world sees as illegal.
And that's only going to make things worse in a region that's already so unstable.
Absolutely. I mean, the peace process was already on shaky ground, and this is just another setback. It's hard to imagine the Palestinians coming back to the negotiating table after this. They feel betrayed.
So where do we go from here? What can we expect from the U.S. in this conflict going forward?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's really hard to say what the long-term consequences of Trump's decision will be.
But maybe we could look at his past actions for clues,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he's already shown that he's willing to break with traditional U.S. policy when it comes to Israel.
Oh, definitely. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, those are major examples.
Yeah, and those were big wins for the Israeli right,
Yeah.
but it caused a lot of tension with the Palestinians and the international community.
Exactly. And let's not forget, Trump even proposed an initiative that would have recognized Israeli sovereignty over those illegal settlement blocks in the West Bank.
So lifting these sanctions could be like the first step in a much bigger shift in U.S. policy.
Right.
And the fact that there are powerful figures in his administration who are pushing for a more pro-settlement stance, well, that's pretty worrying.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, figures like Mike Huckabee and Miriam Adelson, we've already talked about them, they have Trump's ear, and they're going to be pushing him to adopt policies that align with their vision for the region.
And then you have people like Elise Stefanik and Mike Waltz. Their views are pretty concerning.
Oh, yeah. Stefanik especially. She's made statements that really align with the ideology of the Israeli far right, talking about, Israel's biblical right to the West Bank and things like that.
And Waltz, he's Trump's new national security advisor.
Mhm.
And he seems to share those hawkish views that people like John Bolton had.
Right, and that raises the question of whether the U.S. will even continue to try to mediate the conflict.
I mean, if the U.S. is clearly on Israel's side, can there really be any meaningful negotiations?
That's the core issue here. The U.S. has always played a crucial role in trying to bring the Israelis and Palestinians to the table, but now their credibility as an honest broker is in serious doubt.
Yeah, especially after all these recent moves by Trump, it really seems like he's more interested in appeasing the Israeli right than in finding a real solution.
I think that's a fair assessment, and the potential consequences of that are pretty scary.
I mean, we're already seeing more tension, more violence, and a growing lack of trust between the two sides.
Exactly. And without a clear commitment from the U.S. to engage in a fair and balanced way, well, the prospects for peace are looking pretty bleak.
It's a sobering thought. This conflict has been going on for decades, and it just seems to be getting worse.
It's a tragedy, no doubt. And the decisions that are being made right now by the people in power, they're going to have a lasting impact on this conflict for generations to come.
It's a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit here. Let's talk about the human cost of all this. What's like for the Palestinians living in the West Bank
Sure.
with all this tension and all these settlements being built around them?
To be honest, it's a very difficult reality. When these settlements expand, it often means that Palestinians lose their land. Their movement is restricted, and they have limited access to essential resources. Things like water, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It basically creates a system where Palestinians are living under a completely different set of rules than their Israeli neighbors.
Yeah, the article mentions that the UN documented the displacement of thousands of Palestinians just in 2024 alone.
Yeah.
It's hard to even imagine having your home and your livelihood taken away from you like that.
Oh, absolutely. And those reports from Al Jazeera and Amnesty International, they really paint a bleak picture. They document the violence, the intimidation, the fear that many Palestinians face every single day.
And this was all happening even while the sanctions were still in place.
Right.
It's almost frightening to think what it'll be like now that they're gone.
Yeah, it's a very legitimate concern. There's a real fear that lifting the sanctions will just encourage more violence and land grabs.
It feels like the the whole international community needs to respond to this. Aren't there other countries that can step in and hold Israel accountable for what's happening?
Well, there have been calls for international action, but it's a complicated situation. Israel has some powerful allies, the U.S. being one of them. And that makes it really hard to impose any kind of meaningful consequences.
It's so frustrating that these injustices can just continue like this.
It is. It is frustrating. But it's important to remember that there are people out there, people and organizations who are working really hard to document these human rights violations and to advocate for change. They're giving a voice to the people who are being silenced.
Like those reports from Al Jazeera and Amnesty International. They're really important because they're showing the world what's actually happening.
Exactly. And by staying informed ourselves and by raising awareness, we can all play a part in putting pressure on those in power. Pressure to find a solution that's just and fair for everyone involved.
So looking ahead, what do you think might happen in this region? It's already so volatile.
It's it's hard to say for sure, but one possibility is that lifting the sanctions will just embolden the Israeli right even more. That could lead to even more settlement expansion, maybe even annexation of the West Bank.
That sounds pretty bad.
It could be. I mean, it would probably lead to more resistance from the Palestinians,
Yeah.
and that could easily escalate into more violence.
Is there any hope left for a negotiated settlement?
The two-state solution, which has been the framework for peace talks for so long, it's looking less and less likely these days. With the current political climate and the deep mistrust between the two sides, it's hard to see them coming to an agreement anytime soon.
So it sounds like we're stuck in a situation with no easy answers.
It's a complex and challenging situation, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean we should give up hope. I think it's important to keep having these conversations, to engage with different perspectives, and to look for ways to promote understanding and empathy.
Yeah, you're right. We can't just ignore the problem and hope it goes away.
Yeah.
We all have a responsibility to stay informed, to speak out against injustice, and to support the people who are working to find a peaceful resolution.
Absolutely. The future of this region and the lives of millions of people are at stake. We can't afford to be complacent.
It's easy to focus on the big picture, the politics and all that, but
Yeah.
we can't forget about the people who are actually affected by all of this.
Right.
What's it like for the Palestinians who live in the West Bank right now, with all the tension and the settlements expanding around them?
Yeah, it's a tough reality for them, to be honest. When these settlements expand, it often means that Palestinians lose their land. They face restrictions on their movement, and their access to resources is limited, like water, for instance. It basically creates a system where Palestinians have to live under a completely different set of rules compared to their Israeli neighbors.
The article mentioned that the UN documented thousands of Palestinians being displaced in 2024 alone. It's hard to imagine what that must be like, having your home and your whole livelihood taken away from you.
Oh, absolutely. And the reports from Al Jazeera and Amnesty International, they really highlight that. They document the violence, the intimidation, the fear. It's something that many Palestinians experience every single day.
And that was happening even when the sanctions were still in place. It's a scary thought to think what it might be like now that they're gone.
Yeah, it's a legitimate concern. I mean, there's a very real worry that lifting the sanctions could lead to even more violence
Yeah.
and more land grabs.
It feels like the international community needs to step in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't other countries hold Israel accountable for what's happening?
Well, there have been calls for that, for international action, but it's a tricky situation. Israel has some very powerful allies, like the U.S., for example, and that makes it really difficult to impose any kind of meaningful consequences.
It's just frustrating that these injustices can go on, and it seems like there's no accountability.
It is frustrating, but it's important to remember that there are people out there who are working to change that. There are individuals and organizations who are documenting these human rights violations and advocating for change. They're the ones giving a voice to the people who are being silenced.
Like those reports from Al Jazeera and Amnesty International. Right?
Exactly.
They're doing really important work by showing the world what's really going on.
They are. And by staying informed ourselves and by raising awareness, well, we can all put pressure on the people in power. Pressure to find a solution that's fair and just for everyone involved.
So looking ahead, what do you think could happen? What are the possible outcomes in this already volatile region?
Well, it's always hard to predict the future with any certainty, but one scenario is that lifting the sanctions will just embolden the Israeli right, and that could lead to more settlement expansion and maybe even annexation of the West Bank.
That sounds like it could be really bad.
Yeah, it could be. It would probably lead to more resistance from the Palestinians, and that could very easily escalate into more violence.
Is there any hope left for a negotiated settlement?
Well, the two-state solution, which has been the basis for peace talks for decades now, it's looking less and less likely. With the current political climate and the lack of trust between the two sides, it's really hard to imagine them reaching an agreement anytime soon.
So it seems like we're facing a situation that's almost impossible to resolve.
It's a complex situation, that's for sure. But I don't think that means we should give up hope. I think it's more important now than ever to keep having these conversations, to engage with different perspectives and to look for ways to promote understanding and empathy.
You're right. We can't just ignore the problem and hope it goes away. It's our responsibility to stay informed, to speak out against injustice, and to support those who are working to find a peaceful solution.
I couldn't agree more. The future of this region and the lives of millions of people depend on it. We can't afford to be complacent.
Well, this has been a really, really deep dive into a very complex and heartbreaking issue. It's a lot to process, and it definitely leaves us with more questions than answers.
Yeah, that's often the case with conflicts like this. They're multifaceted. But
Mm.
I think by wrestling with these difficult questions and by trying to understand the different perspectives involved, well, we can contribute to a more informed and nuanced conversation.
And and that's got to be the first step towards finding a path to a more peaceful future.
It is. It all starts with awareness, with empathy, and with a willingness to engage in constructive dialogue.
We hope this discussion has been informative and has given you something to think about. We encourage you to keep learning about this issue and to think about the role you can play in promoting peace and justice. Thanks for joining us on the DRM podcast.